Also gonna videotape.
Nobody leaves home anymore.
Nobody leaves home. Well, anyway, so that's my background, and I've covered protests. Terry Waite, who was in captivity for 9 years, the Archbishop of Canterbury envoy to the Middle East, when he ended captivity, I was one of the first people who interviewed him. And I remember I said, what was it like the 9 years? He said, Mike, they weren't bad to me. They took care of me. They just wouldn't let me loose. And he went back to the Middle East years later. Anyway, that's Colin Kaepernick. And today is February 12th, which is Lincoln's birthday, which some people still celebrate. Some people still celebrate. Of course, in the South, the Civil War is known as the War of Northern Aggression, and they don't celebrate it. But in 1863, Lincoln freed the slaves, or the Emancipation Proclamation. That's right. Proclamation. And athletes are people. And African Americans were discriminated against. And they were discriminated against after the Civil War. Laura Ingraham is on Fox News. And Laura Ingraham was getting annoyed with Colin Kaepernick and a whole bunch of the NFL players that took knees, and NBA players who wore t-shirts like LeBron James saying, "I can't breathe," about the guy who the New York police choked to death. And she's getting really upset, and this is Fox, of course, and Fox, she gets on and says to the athletes, "Shut up and dribble." Shut up and dribble. It would come back as a name of a television show by LeBron James. Do protests work? Well, some do, some don't. Most of them don't. But the American Football League All-Star Game in 1965 was scheduled to be played in New Orleans. There was an African-American boycott. 22 players took what was a courageous stand because they could have ended their careers by boycotting that game. That game ended up in Houston, and ultimately, because of that boycott, out of that came the Super Bowl. The National Football League pulled out of a Super Bowl in Tempe, Arizona in 1990 after local voters said no to a Martin Luther King Day. The National Football League was forced to desegregate in Los Angeles in 1946. Why was that? The Los Angeles Coliseum Commission told Daniel Reeves, who wanted to move the Cleveland Rams to Los Angeles, "This place was paid for by federal money and by state money. You have to follow equal opportunity laws." Baseball did not bow to protests in the 1930s and desegregate. Jackie Robinson, of course, is still well known. Jackie Robinson broke the color barrier in baseball 73 years ago. In 1947. But he wasn't the first African American who ever played baseball. That would be Moses Fleetwood Walker with Toledo in 1884 in the American Association. There were no Negro players. I shouldn't say that because the New York Giants tried to pass off 2 Negro players as American Indians in the 19-teens, but didn't get away with it. But officially, there were no African Americans in baseball, Major League Baseball, from 1885 to 1947. Jackie Robinson viewed his sports celebrity as a platform to challenge American racism. The 1960s, players finally began to protest. And protests reemerged within the last 5 or 6 years in the National Basketball Association and the NFL. The NFL with Kaepernick, in the NBA with Donald Sterling, and the Los Angeles Clippers in 2014. This guy, Paul Robeson. Paul Robeson was an All-American football player in 1916 at Rutgers. He was also the valedictorian at Rutgers. He ended up in Columbia Law School. He would go to the Soviet Union back and forth because he enjoyed life in the Soviet Union because there was no racism. His first, at least professional, and let's call college football what it is, professional. His first brush with racism was in 1916. He was a student that was trying to make the Rutgers football team. And he made the team after enduring a brutal initiation right in an inter-squad scrimmage. He survived. He made the team. But on October 14th, 1916, Rutgers is playing William and Mary College, or Washington and Lee College rather. And the coach of Washington and Lee tells Foster Sanford, the coach of Rutgers, can you please bench Robeson? Didn't want a black guy on the field. The game was tied at the time. Rutgers might have won the game, but the coach, Sanford, pulls Robeson. Something happened there. The players could not believe that Robeson was pulled, and they were very upset with their coach. A couple weeks later, the same thing comes about when West Virginia plays Rutgers. The West Virginia coach says, can you pull Robeson out of the game? But the Rutgers coach, Sanford, says no, he left him in the game. The game ends in a 0-0 tie. Robeson makes the game-saving tackle. Many years later, Robeson would perform Showboat in West Virginia, singing his signature song, which was Old Man River. And that was against West Virginia. There's Robeson singing the national anthem in 1942. Robeson was going back and forth to the Soviet Union, and while he was out of sports at this point, Robeson would get in trouble, and Jackie Robinson would not defend him by 1949. By 1943, Robeson is asked to go appear before baseball owners, and he's asked to say to the baseball owners, why don't you have Negro players or colored players in baseball? There are plenty of good players. Josh Gibson is out there. Satchel Paige is out there. Cool Papa Bell. Why aren't there any black players? He appears before the owners in 1943, but the owners have their orders from the Commissioner of Baseball, Kennesaw Mountain Landis, to ignore Robeson and don't ask any questions. Allow him to say his piece. If you have any questions, don't ask him. Landis would die and would be eventually followed by Happy Chandler, who would greet Jackie Robinson in 1946 with Montreal and then with the Dodgers finally in 47. Robeson, a superior athlete, football player at Rutgers, the valedictorian, played in the National Football League in 1921, one of the handful of Negroes in the NFL in 1921. Actor and singer adored in the Soviet Union. Now, there's a 1949 speech that apparently was misquoted, that Robeson said American Negroes would never face or would never fight against the Soviet Union in a war. And that's where Jackie Robinson and Paul Robeson intersects. There is Robeson in one of his roles. Robeson against Jackie. 1949 speech. Robinson is called in to appear before Congress to denounce Robeson. Robeson had traveled many times to the Soviet Union, and the claim was Negroes would never fight against the Soviet Union if there was a war between the United States and the Soviet Union. Robeson would be blackballed. NBC's president and founder, David Sarnoff, would not allow him on the network to do a show. And Robinson would eventually regret going before Congress to denounce Robeson. It's Muhammad Ali and Me, 1985. Unfortunately, by 1985, Muhammad Ali was suffering from Parkinson's and probably CTE for taking 60,000 blows to the head. There wasn't much that he could talk about. The sad part about that day, which was at Madison Square Garden, is that Drew Boudini Brown, who literally was his friend, maybe some advisor, was explaining to Ali, this is how you spell your name, because he was giving autographs and he had forgotten because he was in bad shape at the time. Ali, in 1967, does not go into the military. He identifies with Jack Johnson. Jack Johnson was the heavyweight champion of the world, a boxer, back in the turn of the century, well, a little after the turn of the century. And there's a law on the books called the Mann Act that was aimed right at Jack Johnson. There's a play on Broadway in 1968 called The Great White Hope, where James Earl Jones played Jack Johnson. Ali said if you take the issue of white women, Johnson married 3 white women and was with white women 1909, 1908, which was not a proper thing to do in society. If you take the issue of white women and replace it with religion, that's my story. Johnson dated white women. He's married 3 times, all to white women, and this is where the Mann Act comes in. William Howard Taft signed the Mann Act into law in 1910. The Mann Act, named after Congressman Mann, the law made it illegal to transport any girl or woman over state lines for any immoral purposes, which meant, I suppose, if you were living in New York and went right over the border to Montvale, New Jersey, you could get in trouble, but most people didn't. Johnson was arrested, sent to jail for a year. He would flee to Europe, get out of jail. Once he got out of jail, Trump pardons him in 2018. 2 famous celebrities also fell victim to the Mann Act. One was Charlie Chaplin, the other Chuck Berry, who spent 2 years in jail under the Mann Act. Now, the Mann Act has never been repealed. It's still a law, but nobody is arrested for the Mann Act anymore, but it was aimed at Jack Johnson. Ali, let me just read this, and I'm going to tell you some stories, a story from a friend of mine who is his promoter. Ali said, why should they ask me to put on a uniform and go 10,000 miles from home, Vietnam, and drop bombs and bullets on brown people in Vietnam while so-called Negro people in Louisville are treated like dogs and denied simple human rights? Ali won a medal in the 1960 Rome Olympics. Allegedly, he gets home, faces discrimination, and throws the medal into the Ohio River. Now, that story may not be what it seems to be. Ali told it and then never told it again. But he did talk about racism back in the day. There's me actually with the microphone pulled to me, and I'm asking Ali a question. That's in 1982, when I was 26 years old, interviewing Muhammad Ali. Ali was drafted by the United States military in 1966. He was called to Houston on April the 25th, 1967 for induction. He attends the induction ceremony, but refuses to answer what his name is or take the oath of office, oath of the armed forces rather. Muhammad Ali, probably had he joined the army, would have been like Joe Louis, give some exhibition matches here and there, and that would be it. But he was a conscientious objector, partly because of religion. I had a friend, Shelley Saltman, who passed away February 16th, 2019. Shelley was 87 years old, who ended up being Ali's promoter or promotions guy. And when Ali makes the comeback in 1970 and is facing Joe Frazier, Shelley is called as a PR doctor and promotions doctor, and he says, can you work for me? Ali says to Shelley. And Shelley said, I'll take your money. I'll take your money, but that's all I'm going to do, because you know what? I don't like you. He said, I was in Korea. Now, Shelley did not serve in Korea. Shelley was with Armed Forces Radio Network, but he did serve in the military. And Shelley told me Muhammad Ali sat down with him for 3.5 hours and explained why he was a conscientious objector. Afterwards, Shelley came away saying this guy is a true believer in his religion and a conscientious objector. Shelley would work with Ali from 1970, 71 through about 1979. He quits in 1979 because he doesn't want to see his friend getting annihilated in the ring anymore. He said Ali should not have fought anymore, and that was his protest. He said, I love Muhammad Ali, but you know what? He lasted too long. The fight doctor, Ferdy Pacherko, also quit. The inner circle, Ali's inner circle was leaving him, trying to send the message, don't do this anymore. Ali would be arrested and convicted. He was stripped of his heavyweight title by the World Boxing Association, stripped of his New York State boxing license, both without due process. He never got due process. They never sat down with him and never gave him his turn to explain why he did what he did when he did it. Eventually, the conviction would be overturned by the Supreme Court in 1971, 8-0. One quick Ali story from Shelley. About 1975, Ali signs to this wrestling boxing exhibition against a Japanese wrestler named Antonio Inaki. It's in Tokyo. And Anaki is just laying on the canvas and just kicking Ali's legs, just kicking and kicking and kicking. Ali gets some blood clots afterwards, and they're supposed to hospitalize him. He says, no, I'm going to South Korea. I made a commitment to entertain the troops in South Korea, giving exhibition boxing matches. They said, that could kill you. You've got infections. You need to take care of those infections. Didn't listen to the doctors. He went to the bases in South Korea, did the exhibition, then went to the hospital afterwards because he made the commitment to the United States military. The Cleveland Summit, there's Ali. This is 1967, after he was stripped of the title. Among the people there, Bill Russell to Ali's right, Jim Brown, the running back from the Cleveland Browns, who was 2 years after his career at this point, a very young Lou Alcindor. In the back, there's a guy by the name of Walter Beach, who I'm going to talk about in a couple of minutes. My buddy Flea Roberts is in the back there, next to Bobby Mitchell. He's next to Carl Stokes. Carl Stokes would become the mayor of Cleveland eventually. And the Cleveland Summit, 11 athletes. They're interviewing Ali to see if he's legitimate or not, if he's a draft dodger or he has legitimate beliefs. And they're going to support him if he's legitimate. Jim Brown said, I felt with Ali taking the position he was taking, and with him losing the crown and the government coming at him with everything they had, that we as a body of prominent athletes could get the truth and stand behind Ali and give him the necessary support. Ali did get some support from athletes, including Joe Frazier, who helped him out economically prior to their fight, March 8th, 1971. It's Walter Beach. We talked about Green Book, right? Talked about Green Book. Walter Beach was just another football player. He ended up in law school. He was just another football player. He went to college at Central Michigan University. And he was playing with the Boston Patriots in 1961. And Walter Beach probably was the first African-American athlete to stage a protest. He was fired by the Boston Patriots in the American Football League in 1961, labeled as a troublemaker for organizing a protest among the black players on the Boston team against segregated living conditions during the team's road trip in New Orleans. He couldn't stay in the fancy hotel. He had to go across town to a rundown hotel. Couldn't eat with his teammates in the restaurant. Had to eat across town. He couldn't go on the same bus as his teammates. And he decided to organize the black players on the Patriots, and the owner, Billy Sullivan, didn't like that and fired him. In a couple minutes, I'm going to talk about Abner Haynes and the protest in New Orleans. Abner Haynes is an old buddy of mine. He's now living in Dallas. He's about 83, 84 years old. He was the first football player, African-American football player, to ever play regularly in the state of Texas, starting in 1956 with North Texas University. And in 1961, same year Walter Beach was fired, he was playing with the Dallas Texans. And the Dallas Texans are playing a preseason football game in Fayetteville, Arkansas, against the San Diego Chargers. Because in those days, if you signed the player who went to the college and was a very popular player, you tried to play a preseason game to get as many people in the stands to make as much money as possible. Abner flies with his teammates from Dallas into Fayetteville. And Hank Stram, the coach of the Dallas Texans, says, Abner, who was the captain, one of the captains of the Texans, Abner, you know the drill. There's your bus. You know where you're staying. We'll see you at practice and we'll see you at the game. And Abner went with the program at that point because that's what was going on in the South. Walter Beach didn't want to do that. Colin Kaepernick, all those years later, was blackballed. I say more than likely blackballed because it's never been proven in a court of law. Why he protested? He protested against police brutality against African Americans. A guy by the name of Harry Edwards provides a link between the 1968 Mexico City protest by John Carlos and Tommy Smith and Colin Kaepernick. He was the guy, Edwards, who helped put together the 1968 planned protests against poverty and all that other stuff in the United States. Kaepernick reached a settlement with the league. A tryout this year was botched. He's basically a political activist. The protest, well, there's the protest. He was protesting and nobody noticed until a sports writer noticed it prior to a preseason game against the Green Bay Packers. And that became a story because he was on one knee quietly during the national anthem. It was August 26th. Colin Kaepernick refused to stand for the national anthem. I'm not going to stand up to show pride in a flag for a country that oppresses black people and people of color. To me, this is bigger than football, and it would be selfish on my part to look the other way. That protest came 21 years after another protest in the National Basketball Association by Abdul Rauf, who was playing with Denver. Funny thing about the NFL, they didn't really care about protests prior to 2012. Because in 2012, the NFL started taking money from the Pentagon, taxpayers' money, $53 million over a 4-year period to advertise during football games. Like I said, the NFL made no big deal about the anthem. In fact, players weren't even on the field during the anthem. They were back in the locker room. The anthem was about 15 minutes before the game. Pentagon money comes in, and all of a sudden the NFL finds patriotism. Harry Edwards. It's Harry Edwards. Harry Edwards is 6'9", weighs about 300 pounds. We're in Indianapolis in 2001. He said, "Get over here." I said, "Yes." He said, "Sit down, we're having breakfast together." "Yes, sir, you're 6'9", 300 pounds. "Sure." And Harry went through a whole bunch of things as we talked for about 2.5 hours in Indianapolis. He is was and is a sociology professor at Berkeley. And also was an advisor to the San Francisco 49ers in race relation matters. In 1967-68, he forms the Olympic Project for Human Rights, and that was for the Olympics in Mexico City. Edwards coached Kaepernick when he learned of the protests to tell him what they were doing back in the 1960s. So some of the 1960s protests remain through this day. And that's the Olympic badge, the Olympic Project for Human Rights. And that badge would get somebody in trouble. Peter Norman of Australia in 1968. But as they say in the business, you're just going to have to wait until we get around to it. 1964-65, 3 years earlier, Walter Beach has his protest. American Football League plans a preseason game in New Orleans. New Orleans is looking for a football team. And the American Football League is looking at New Orleans saying, you know, that would be a good market for us. We're in Houston already. We're in Dallas. We were in Dallas. We're in Kansas City now. But you know what? We want to expand to a 9th team. And the best way to do it, well, we'll go to Tulane Stadium, have an all-star game. And New Orleans leaders wanted them there. Now, this is a picture of American Football League all-stars, African Americans, actually in those days, Negroes, and they're stuck at the airport because no cab would pick them up. So they're there waiting 3.5 hours after they were promised by Louisiana officials and New Orleans elected officials, hey, Jim Crow, thing of the past. Segregation, thing of the past. Johnson signs the Civil Rights Act into law in 1964 in July. You guys are going to go there and you're going to have the time of your life. Play in a game, all-star game, we're going to put a new team in there, and you guys are going to have a great time on Bourbon Street. This all happens in a 36-hour period. 22 African-American players can't get cabs. Or they could get cabs. They could get cabs if a white player said, I'm taking a colored guy into the cab. Because in New Orleans, that's the only way you could get a cab back in those days. Jack Kemp was the president of the American Football League Players Association. He is a pivotal guy in this boycott. Jack Kemp was quarterback with the Buffalo Bills, and he was also a Barry Goldwater delegate during the 1964 Republican Convention and campaign for Barry Goldwater, which meant by taking the action he did, he could have killed 2 careers in one shot, his football career and his political career. Ron Mix, who's still in San Diego, he's 82, 83 years old, he's an attorney, was on one of the squads, the Western squad for the American Football League. He said, "We were aware that New Orleans was hosting the game to demonstrate to the American Football League and the National Football League that they, New Orleans, could support the football franchise. The last thing we wanted to do was assist them in demonstrating they could support a franchise. A boycott was the only alternative." Cookie Gilchrist was with the Buffalo Bills, and he knows about the Cavs, and he begins to hear other stories. Other stories that included the San Diego Chargers defensive players, Ernie Ladd, all 6'9" of him, 315 pounds, who went to Grambling University in Louisiana. He and Earl Faison decided, hey, we're on Bourbon Street. Hey, they promised us everything was going to be okay, so we're going to relax. There were very few things you could do on Bourbon Street. You could drink, you could go to honky tonks, and you could go to strip joints. That remains the same through this day. They decide to go into a place, and the bouncer is there. And he looks at Ernie Ladd and says, "They don't want you here." Ernie Ladd said, "We're staying here." The guy got courage because he took out a gun. The players left. Gilchrist heard about that too. Hey, segregation is gone. Jim Crow, that ended. We won the football team. The American Football League was the only league in America at that point that truly embraced Negro players as equal to white players. They were starting a new league in 1959, and they needed players. National Football League had a quota, 4 Negro players per team. Couldn't be quarterbacks, couldn't be middle linebackers, couldn't be centers, couldn't be defensive backs. Why? They weren't smart enough. American Football League, no, we're going to get centers, and we're going to get middle linebackers like Willie Lanier, and we're going to get defensive backs like Willie Brown, and we're going to get them out of the black traditional schools because they have great football programs, and they did. They went to Grambling, and they went to Bethune-Cookman, and Texas A&I, and Prairie View, and Morgan State to get football players. National Football League, they were going to the white schools. They were going to the big conferences. And the southern schools, well, they barred black players until 1964, 65, when all of a sudden, Bear Bryant could bring a black player into the University of Alabama. Civil rights movement killed the traditional black schools football programs because the black players, the really good black players, went to the football factories. There's Abner. I told you about Abner in 1961. Remember the old hand-cranked elevators where somebody would sit there, open the gate, and go like that, up and down? Abner Haynes goes to the Hotel Roosevelt with his teammate David Grayson. They finally get cabs, the colored cabs. He sent out the colored cabs to get them. Checks into the Roosevelt Hotel, doesn't have any problems checking into the Hotel Roosevelt. David Grayson and Abner Haynes decide, well, we need to take the elevator. Get to the elevator. Abner says there's an old woman sitting there. She opens the door, opens the gate, looks up and says, "Hey monkeys, what are you doing here?" They had a woman operating the elevator, and she said, "You monkeys come in, get to the back." Finally, we had about 10 or 12 guys in my room. We're talking sensibly. We're going to stay together. This was just another test. Remember, Abner was the first African American to play regular college football in Texas in 1956. We had no leverage. We're playing for money. We weren't playing for money. They weren't going to get much money. We were playing for progress. Football players took the lead. He said, "Abner, you didn't take the lead." I said, "Rosa Parks took the lead in Montgomery. The students who protested at the Woolworth counter in Greensboro, North Carolina, they took the lead. the freedom marches, the other marches, they took the lead. But in football, these guys really did take the lead, except for Walter Beach. And they got rid of Walter Beach, who ended up playing football in Cleveland. Places like Atlanta, New Orleans, Miami were death holes. David Grayson couldn't get a drink at our bar. Our white teammates in New Orleans were there for us. Guys like him, Jack Kemp. That's back in May of 1979. I'm interviewing Kemp, who came through Spark Hill, New York. I gave Kemp that picture about 20 years later. He looked at me and he said, "What happened to your hair?" I looked at him, I said, "What happened to your wig? It's all white now." He said, "Let's go get a drink." I said, "You're paying." But Jack Kemp was the president of the American Football League Players Association, quarterback, Buffalo Bills, delegate for Barry Goldwater. Hayes, one of the things the AFL needed is the unity of the white players and the black players for our new league. When the white players, Kemp, Jerry Mays, our Kansas City defensive leader, and 4 or 5 other guys like Ron Mix, heard about what was happening, their characters showed, and my teammates were looking after me. All within 36 hours, the players disappeared. Kemp makes the call, these guys aren't going to play. The owner of the Houston Oilers, Bud Adams, says, "It's okay, we'll move the game to Houston." None of the players were blackballed. The Pro Football Hall of Fame has a little civil rights exhibit about these guys. These guys did it all on their own. There was no Martin Luther King there. There was no Ralph Abernathy there. There was no march for them, no support. Just the white players and the owners that took their place. Jim Brown told me years later that the only time he voted for a Republican at the top of the presidential ticket was in 1996 for Bob Dole and Jack Kemp. And he said the reason why was Jack Kemp put his money where his mouth was. He put his professional career on the line, and he put his political career on the line to help the brothers. Meanwhile, New Orleans was on the outside looking in. The NFL couldn't go to New Orleans. The colored cab policy continued. Eventually, New Orleans would become a political pawn when the American Football League and the National Football League decided to merge in 1966. Russell Long, the Democrat from Louisiana, and Hale Boggs, the Democrat, Senator Russell Long, Congressman Hale Boggs. Hale Boggs, the father of Cokie Roberts, worked out a deal with the National Football League for the merger. Out of the ashes of that rose the Super Bowl. And Hale Boggs told New Orleans, "Get your act together. No more of this, hey, they're going to the other side of town. No more of that Green Book stuff. Colored people can get cabs. Colored people can be in restaurants. No separate drinking fountains anymore. No separate bathrooms anymore. We're going into the 20th century." Reverend Martin Luther King Day, that's my wife, that's 2015, and that is the Martin Luther King Center in Atlanta. And that's you're going on one of the marches through the South, where you got a young black guy, an older black guy, a military veteran who lost a leg, an average housewife, and you're reliving some of the marches as you went through there. National Football League gets stuck in Arizona. 1986, Ronald Reagan signs the bill creating the National Martin Luther King Day, and Arizona signs on. But Arizona gets a new governor in 1987, Evan Meacham, and he says, we don't need another federal holiday. He's supported by John McCain, who agrees with Meacham. McCain would say that was one of the biggest mistakes he ever made in the Senate, supporting Meacham in getting rid of the Martin Luther King holiday. Bill Bidwell moved the St. Louis Cardinals into Phoenix, and they weren't doing well in selling tickets. The NFL decided to help him out. Okay, you buy the tickets, you have a chance to get a Super Bowl ticket in 1993 in Tempe, Arizona, Super Bowl 27. The state legislature in 1989 overturns Meacham, but there's a petition drive in Arizona, and they get enough signatures on the petition to force a referendum on whether or not there should be a Martin Luther King Day. The NFL tells Arizona voters, you don't pass the Martin Luther King Day because people like Stevie Wonder are boycotting the state, convention planners are bypassing the state, the NFL Players Association doesn't want the Super Bowl there unless there's a King holiday. If you pass the King holiday, we keep the Super Bowl there. If you don't pass the King holiday, we're pulling it. They didn't pass the King holiday in 1990. The NFL pulled the Super Bowl. But the NFL said, hey, if you do this again, and they decide to do this again in 1992 in terms of voting on the King Day, we will give you a Super Bowl as soon as humanly possible, which would be 4 months after the election during the NFL owners meeting, for the next available Super Bowl, which is 1996. But you got to vote for the Martin Luther King Day holiday. In 1992, with enormous pressure from the NFL, Arizona voters said yes to the King holiday. The NFL put the Super Bowl back into Tempe in 1986. And there's the Ebenezer Baptist Church in Atlanta. Eventually, the Super Bowl would be played in Tempe, Arizona. Los Angeles Coliseum, back in 1982, or 83 as I was standing there. The Los Angeles Coliseum is the place where the NFL integrated in 1946. Now, Robeson, as I mentioned, was part of the NFL. In 1921, the NFL kicked out all of the black players by 1932, and they were going to continue the white-only policy as long as they could. Daniel Reeves owned the Cleveland Rams in the National Football League, and after the 1945 season decided, I'm going to move the team to Los Angeles. He meets with the Los Angeles Coliseum Commission. The commissioners say, here's the lease, but you got to do one thing. You got to desegregate. You have to hire Negro players, because this facility was built by federal and state money, and we have a law, equal opportunity employment. Reeves would sign the contract and also would hire Kenny Washington, who was a great football player, and Woody Strode to contracts. You might remember Woody Strode because Kirk Douglas died a couple days ago, and Kirk Douglas was in Spartacus. Woody Strode was in Spartacus. Woody Strode became an actor. Those two might as well play with the Duluth Eskimos because they were frozen out by their teammates. But in the NFL in 1946, they desegregated because of the Coliseum commissioners. It is believed that the Boston, then Washington owner, George Preston Marshall, pushed for the ban in 1932. It's my old buddy, Wally Triplett, who passed away last year. And he started in the NFL in 1949. He's wearing a t-shirt that he made up. Negroes finally listed. They finally could sign with an NFL team. Wally was drafted. He played in the National Football League in 1949, 1950. Went to Korea. He played for Detroit. Went to Korea in 51 and 52. Tried to come back with the Chicago Cardinals in 53, but just didn't make it. He was the one who told me about the quota system in the National Football League. Racism in college football, Penn State University is invited to the Cotton Bowl in Dallas, January 1st, 1948. Wally told me this story because he's right in the middle of it. In fact, Wally was recruited by the University of Miami, and they were going to give him a full scholarship in about 1944. They never saw him play. They didn't know that he was a black guy, but they heard he was a good football player. And he was telling me, he sent back the stuff, and oh, by the way, I'm a Negro. And he gets a letter a couple days later, thanks for your interest, we'll see you later. He ends up at Penn State, and he is invited with his teammates to play in the Cotton Bowl, except the Cotton Bowl officials want no part of Wally Triplett and Dennis Hybert, two black players on the Penn State team. Steve Suey, who is the captain of the Penn State team, meets with people, and he tells the Penn State coaching staff, we're Penn State. We all go, or none of us go. And there's a problem, because the Cotton Bowl wants Penn State. Finally, they're playing Southern Methodist University, and Southern Methodist University comes up with a solution. You'll stay in the Dallas area. You could play in the Cotton Bowl, but you're going to play at the Dallas Naval Air Station. Now, what I never understood, because I've been in Dallas a couple times, is there is no real body of water around Dallas. How could you have a naval station when you have no real body of water around Dallas? There's a river there. Anyway, Penn State said, yeah, we'll practice at the military facility, and we'll eat there, and we'll just play the game. And that's how the Cotton Bowl was desegregated. The unofficial quota, as Wally said, 4 Negroes per team. No Negro could be a quarterback. Negro quarterbacks became ends, wide receivers, or running backs. No centers, no middle linebackers. Negroes lacked intelligence. And that's the way the NFL looked at Negroes in the 1950s into the 1960s. John Wooden played with the Cleveland Browns. John Wooden had his episode, Miami Orange Bowl. Same thing as Wally Triplett. This is 1957. And Wooden told me the story about he and Frank Clark, who was a receiver with Colorado. Colorado was invited to play in the Orange Bowl against Clemson, January 1st, 1957. But the Orange Bowl people said, we don't want Wooden and we don't want Clark. And University of Colorado's athletic director, Harry Dean Carson, said, you better talk to those Orange Bowl people because we're not leaving our players at home. As Wooden said, these were the kind of things that were going on and people spoke out against it. Wooden ended up playing in that game, ended up playing with the Cleveland Browns, and he told me in the National Football League in the 1960s, Dallas and Washington were the 2 worst places to play. Ironically, Wooden would end up with Washington towards the end of the 1960s. Paul Brown was coach of the All-American Football Conference Cleveland Browns that started in 1946. As he once told me, I didn't care if a player was white, black, green, or yellow. If the player could play, the player was going to play. Very quietly, he signed Bill Willis and Marion Motley in his own little way. Paul Brown was a civil rights pioneer in 1946. I don't put Vince Lombardi in here, but because we're in New Jersey, I will mention Vince Lombardi. Vince Lombardi desegregated Green Bay. He brought in Emlyn Tunnell, who was one of his players when he was assistant coach of the New York Giants, to open up the door for black players in Green Bay because Lombardi knew if he was going to win, he needed black players. Emlyn Tunnell ended up being the perfect guy. By 1967, Lombardi had 13 players, African-American players on his team. That was a high in the National Football League. Lombardi also hired gay players. Lombardi's brother Tom, who was a priest, Catholic priest, was gay. And Lombardi had no problems with gay players, no problems with black players. And all of Lombardi's players, virtually all of them, loved him, despite the fact that he was the baddest-ass coach going. Richard Nixon was so impressed with Lombardi that he wanted Lombardi to run as vice president in 1968, Republican ticket, and he found out that Vince Lombardi was a Democrat. So he chose Spiro Agnew instead. That's George Preston Marshall. Take a look at that look. He became the owner of the Boston team in the NFL that moved to Washington. 1932, the Boston team, he takes him to Washington in 1937. As I said, an NFL team in the 1950s could have up to 4 Negro players. George Preston Marshall had 0. Shirley Povich was the Washington Post sports editor. You might know his son, Maury Povich. Shirley was once asked about Maury, about the show he did. Who's your papa? And Shirley lived to like 100 years old. And he said, he was asked, he said, well, what do you think of the show? He said, I didn't like it. And Maury showed me his paycheck, and I said, how do I get one of those shows? Anyway, he would write columns about how Washington should have Negro players. And Marshall once responded to him by saying, we will have Negro players on our team when the Harlem Globetrotters hire a white guy. Well, this guy comes into office in 1961. And one of his 2 signature sports things, he signed the Sports Broadcast Act into law in 1961. That's one. The other was he forced black players onto the Washington team, despite George Marshall being an avowed racist. Cleveland traded Bobby Mitchell. Best thing that ever happened to him, because he became the toast of the town. Every party in Washington for 40 years wasn't a party unless Bobby Mitchell was there. And I told him one day, I said, best thing that ever happened to you? He said, yeah, sure beats being a dentist in Cleveland, huh? Because he wanted to be a dentist. This was a straight football trade initiated by the Kennedy administration. Cleveland got the NFL rights to the Syracuse running back Ernie Davis, who never played with Cleveland because he got leukemia and died. The Washington owner, George Preston Marshall, never hid his racial views. He never hired any Negro players for his team until Stuart Udell basically got his arm like this and twisted his arm. The reason he twisted his arm was this: model for the new DC Stadium. And Marshall wanted to play in DC Stadium, which became RFK Stadium after Robert Kennedy was killed. Brand new stadium, bigger seating capacity, more revenues coming out of the stadium, and Marshall wanted that. Griffith Stadium was just an old stadium and needed to go by 1961. The stadium issue forced Marshall's hand. Stuart Udell, who was the Secretary of the Interior, said to Marshall, you have to obey legislation which prohibited discrimination at federal facilities. A lot of buildings that are built in Washington are federal facilities. DC Stadium was a federal facility. Udell would give Marshall an ultimatum: hire Negro players or play somewhere else. He did hire a Negro player in Bobby Mitchell and brought in Charlie Taylor and others eventually. That is Moses Fleetwood Walker, who's a catcher with the Toledo Blue Stockings of the American Association in 1884. The American Association was a major league in 1884, and Toledo was a major league city in 1884. He would make his debut on May 1st of that year as a catcher for the Toledo Blue Stockings in a game against Louisville, the Louisville Eclipse squad. From all accounts, he was welcomed by his teammates, except for Tony Mullane, the star pitcher. Tony Mullane didn't particularly want to throw to a Negro player, but he did say that Walker was probably the smartest catcher he ever threw to. Walker was a pre-law student, as was Paul Robeson. In 1883, the Chicago White Stockings played Toledo in an exhibition game. Toledo was not in the major leagues at that point. And Cap Anson was the star player of the Chicago White Stockings team, which would become eventually the Chicago Cubs, one of the biggest stars in the game. And he's furious because his team is facing a team with a black player, and he threatens not to play. Except, by threatening not to play and forfeiting the game, he would also forfeit the money. So he decided to play for the money. He said he would never play against a team that had a black man on the field. About 1908, he would, as an old man, play in an exhibition game against a team that had two black players. Anson was very vocal, both on the field and off the field, about keeping baseball segregated, to the point where he is considered the father of segregated baseball. The father, he might not be. Andrew Johnson invited Washington players to the White House in 1865, unified the country after the Civil War over baseball. But one of his proteges ended up with the Washington team in 1867 and basically threw up a color barrier. Anson put up the last color barrier back in 1884. Walker played 42 games in 1884. He was joined by his brother Weldy. Both of the Walker's careers in the major leagues ended in 1884. Here come the protests. I actually met Sam Lacey. I met him in the 1980s, 50 years after this story. He was an older gentleman working for a Baltimore newspaper. I never really spoke to him other than hi, and we was hi and goodbye, and that was basically it. But he was around during my time. In 1936, Lacey began to lobby the Washington Senators owner Clark Griffin to considering adding star players from the Negro Leagues, in particular, those from the Homestead Grays. The Homestead Grays, a Negro League team, that team was playing in the stadium that Griffin owned, which is ironically on the grounds today, or was on the grounds of Howard University. Lacey would finally get a meeting with the Senator's owner Griffin in December 1937. I used the old cliche about Washington being first in war, first in peace, last in the American League, and that he could remedy that. But he told me the climate was not right in 1937. He pointed out there were a lot of Southerners in the league, and there would be constant confrontations, and moreover, it would break up the Negro Leagues. He saw the Negro Leagues, the Homestead Grays franchise, as a source of revenue. Wendell Smith is portrayed as one of Jackie Robinson's friends, and Wendell Smith is the guy who allegedly recommended to Branch Rickey, hire Jackie Robinson. He's the perfect guy. Smith is credited with that recommendation, and Rickey was searching for an individual with strong character to successfully execute the integration of baseball. Rickey comes a little late to the game because this is the 1930s, and this is New York in the 1930s. Admit Negroes to big league baseball. There were protests outside of Yankee Stadium, outside of the Polo Grounds, outside of Ebbets Field, protests like that. There were also protests in Chicago, outside of Wrigley Field, outside of Comiskey Park. The protesters would gather signatures. They would get 1.5 million signatures saying, open up baseball to Negroes. At the New York World's Fair in 1940, the Trade Union Athletic Association held a rally, End Jim Crow in Baseball, during the New York World's Fair. So you got 1.5 million signatures on petitions that are delivered to the Commissioner, Kennesaw Mountain Landis. And there's Kennesaw Mountain Landis, who never lifted a finger to try and end the baseball color barrier. He comes in about 1920 after the Black Sox scandal, and he's there until his death in the 1940s. The petitions asked whether the fans of the Yankees, Dodgers, and Giants would still support the team if they signed a black player. They said yes. When asked point blank, Landis, the former federal judge, said it wasn't his decision in terms of bringing in Negro players. It was the owner's decision. And the owners didn't want it, except the owners were getting an awful lot of heat on them. Politics. Running for re-election, New York City Council in 1945, Ben Davis, who's an old friend of Robeson, an African-American former college football star, a communist, distributed a leaflet, photos of two blacks, a dead soldier and a baseball player. It said, good enough to die for his country, but not good enough for organized baseball. Fiorello LaGuardia was getting involved. The New York State Legislature passed the Quinn Ives Act, which banned discrimination in hiring, and soon formed a committee to investigate discrimination in businesses, particularly the baseball business. Rickey came along at the right time because there was a lot of heat on baseball to hire a Negro player. As my old buddy, Ralph Kiner, would point out. Now, I knew Ralph between 1980 and into the 1990s. And when I covered Met games, when I was covering sports, I used to sneak out between the third and fourth inning and go into the diner area and sit with Ralph and listen to Ralph tell stories. Because he was a great storyteller. His next door neighbor in Palm Springs was a guy by the name of Phil Harris. You might remember Phil Harris from the Jack Benny Show, and smoked that cigarette. And Ralph learned a lot from Phil Harris in terms of being a comedic value. Kiner's view of the desegregation. It was another part of the changeover of baseball. It had to happen sooner or later. It was really an aftermath of World War II. Ralph was a World War II veteran, where the black players, the Negroes, fought for our side. They had to be recognized. There was a movement at the time, and I told you about the movement, about the protests, about New York City legislators and New York State legislators getting on the backs of the Brooklyn Dodgers and the Yankees and the Giants owners. There was a movement that they were going to bring black players into the game. Ricky, and Ralph Kiner hated Branch Rickey, hated him. He played for him in Pittsburgh. Rickey would never give him more money, even though he led the National League in home runs. He once said to Ralph Kiner, "We finished 8th with you, we can finish 8th, last place without you." Rickey was the man who picked Robinson. It was a brilliant choice. Jackie Robinson would retire in baseball, but he would not retire as a Brooklyn Dodger. He would retire as a New York Giants player because Walter O'Malley didn't like Jackie Robinson, traded him to the New York Giants. Jackie was going to retire anyway, but he traded him. And Jackie never got a job in baseball. He became an executive with Chock full of nuts. Chock full of nuts, it's the heavenly coffee, heavenly coffee. Better coffee of billionaires, money can't buy. Chock full of nuts restaurant chain. I can't do that outside of the New York area because they don't know that song. Whoa. Oh, there we go. That's not good. I may have to make me work if that doesn't work. Anyway, Jackie Robinson lent his name to companies, in addition to being the chock full of nuts guy. Several business ventures, construction company, and bank owned in Harlem. But he never got a job in baseball. Walter O'Malley, in fact, in 1968, when Walter O'Malley owned the Los Angeles Dodgers, after Martin Luther King was assassinated, baseball didn't know what to do. Whether or not they should postpone the game scheduled for Martin Luther King's burial. Virtually every team decided, you know what, we'll play the game another day, except Walter O'Malley's Los Angeles Dodgers. They were going to play opening day on April 9th. And the Philadelphia Phillies, led by Bill White, who became the Yankee announcer, we're not showing up. We're not showing up at all. Play, we'll forfeit. Eventually, the Dodgers caved in and postponed the game. Pumpsie Green was the last player to integrate the original 16. 8 teams in the National League, 8 teams in the American League, with the Boston Red Sox in 1959. Pumpsie Green is brought up to the Red Sox after the Boston Bruins, in an all-white sport at that time, hockey, had a black player, Willie O'Ree, on their roster. Tom Yorkie was from South Carolina. He was the owner of the Boston Red Sox, and he moved very, very, very slowly in hiring a Negro player, and that would happen in 1959. You might remember Al Campanis was fired after he appeared on Ted Koppel on the 40th anniversary of Jackie Robinson making the Brooklyn Dodger team. Campanis was actually Jackie Robinson's roommate and a friend of Jackie Robinson. He gets on the Nightline show with Ted Koppel, and Koppel is asking him, why aren't there more black managers? For some reason, Campanis said, no, I don't believe there's prejudice. I truly believe that they may not have some of the necessities to be, let's say, a field manager or perhaps a general manager. Koppel tried to pull him in. Koppel was trying to basically undo the damage because Koppel realized, uh-oh, this question did a lot of damage. And Campanis continued and continued. Koppel couldn't save him. Campanis was fired as the Dodger general manager. Never worked again in the Major League front office, but was a regular at Dodger games. They didn't let him, he wasn't ostracized, and California Angel games. He would take notes, do some scouting, and if you wanted his opinion, you got it for nothing. He tried to write a book, and he did write a book. But for 2 years, he couldn't find any publisher interested in My Turn at Bat. The publishers weren't interested. And Campanis, the Al Campanis moment on television. Curt Flood decided to challenge baseball's reserve clause. Now, he wasn't the first guy who did it. Danny Gardella did it after going to the Mexican League in the 1940s. And eventually he would reach a settlement with baseball and all would be well. But Curt Flood would not reach a settlement with baseball. He's traded by the St. Louis Cardinals to the Philadelphia Phillies in December of 1969. And all of a sudden it dawns on him, hey, I'm just a piece of meat. Now he's following the civil rights movement. He's really following the civil rights movement and Dr. King and everything else that's going on in the South. I interviewed him And this is verbatim of the interview. I had asked him about the baseball winter meetings. This is the early 1990s. And I said, it's a meat market for baseball teams to trade human beings for others in the hope that the teams will improve and the teams forget that they trade a human being. Kurt Flood starts by saying, Evan, I'm so pleased that you said that. I guess, and he talks about the trade, I guess a week went by before you say to yourself, this is not a joke. This is serious. You no longer work here. Mrs. Flood has to move. He has to move the kids to Philadelphia. Doesn't want to do that. And I guess about a week, talked to Alan Zerman, my attorney in St. Louis. He said, Kurt, you know, baseball's been doing this to men for 200 years. Actually 100 years, because first professional baseball player was paid in 1869. We're the first team, Cincinnati Red Sox. And you're part of the machinery, and there's very little you can do about it. You can challenge this if you want, and it started to germinate then. Something illegal had been done to me. Something almost inhumane had been done to me. It kind of snowballed from there. I learned a lot about the law system, because he would sue. And how it operates. I guess not playing that one year, 1970, it's necessary to be damaged in that 1 year, and that would have done it. He missed 1970. And I thought about, well, later on, and I wished I had not played 1 year, 1971, with the Washington Senators. The only thing that made me do it was the manager, Ted Williams. I love him. He lost in the Supreme Court eventually. Arthur Goldberg was his attorney, former Supreme Court justice. The Supreme Court, I guess, felt the same way, that being a baseball player is the best of all worlds, and I ought to sit down somewhere and shut up. Those words would come back in 2018. The Supreme Court didn't say that. They said someone else was, they said they were going to leave this decision to someone else, and someone else would be Peter Seitz, the arbitrator, who would end baseball's reserve clause, and Kurt Flood gets a lot of credit for that. But he did lose in the Supreme Court. The NBA barred Negro players from 1946 to 1950. It starts out as the BBA, the Basketball Association of America. It becomes the NBA in 1949 with a merger of sorts with the National Basketball League, who had Negro players in 1942. And there were Negro players that were very widely accepted, like the Harlem Globetrotters and the New York Reds. But for some reason, the NBA owners, or the BAA owners, decided they didn't want Negro players. The new basketball league started in 1946. The big population centers, New York, Philadelphia, Boston. Arena owners wanted to fill dates with basketball games. For some reason, they put up a color barrier. John McClendon was coaching for the North Carolina College for Negroes. And he would alert NBA teams or BAA teams of players who he felt could play in the league. By 1950, McClendon goes down to the Washington Capitals training camp and talks to Mike Uline, who was the Capitals owner. And he says, I got some players you need to look at. McClendon forces the issue. The players go down. 2 players go down for a tryout. And guess what? They make the team. He said to me the Washington Capitals were the first team to have historically black school products on the team. They preceded Boston by a week. We're 2 guys ahead of the Boston Celtics, Chuck Cooper. They were Harold Hunter and Earl Lloyd. Earl Lloyd was the first black player to play in the NBA, although the NBL had black players in 1942. There was one Japanese player, though, in the BAA. He played 3 games for the New York Knicks. His name was Wat Misaka. And Wat Misaka was a Japanese-American player who was on the roster in 1947, 2 years after World War II. And less than a year after the internment camps had ended in March of 1946. The Misaka family was in Utah, and they were not ordered into internment camps. The internment camps were only in California, Oregon, and Washington. McClendon was the first coach of a professional basketball team in the American Basketball League for George Steinbrenner's Cleveland Pipers in 1961. And George got heavily involved with the Cleveland Pipers, really heavily involved with the Cleveland Pipers, and drove McClendon nuts. So much so that the next basketball job he took was in Malaysia, teaching basketball in Malaysia. Why Malaysia? To get as far away as you could from George Steinbrenner. But he was the first black coach in pro basketball history with George Steinbrenner's Cleveland Pipers in 1961. George was 30 years old at the time. He just interfered with everything. Protests really start in 1961 with Walter Beach. This one comes after Walter Beach, and that's Bill Russell with the Boston Celtics. After Walter Beach, people think this is the first one. Russell might have gotten the idea from Walter Beach. Lexington, Kentucky, the Boston Celtics go to play a preseason game in 1961. Bill Russell, who grew up in Louisiana, and other black members of the Boston Celtics team refused service at a restaurant. They boycotted the game. In 1961, blacks were not expected to publicly complain about discrimination. Walter Beach, in 1961, was fired by Boston. I didn't throw this in the slides, but Meadowlark and Lemon, who was the clown prince of the Harlem Globetrotters, and I had a long discussion. And we were talking about playing in the South and how the Globetrotter players were treated like kings everywhere but the American South. And he said we'd go and we'd entertain, and they'd cheer us, and then we'd go into a restaurant, and we couldn't get in. And he said that he spent a lot of time in his hotel room. Meadowlark Lemon stuttered. And he was telling me, he stuttered, but he wanted to be the clown prince of the Harlem Globetrotters. So those long nights and long days in the two-bit hotels that the Globetrotters stayed in the South, he would take a Coca-Cola bottle, and he'd make believe it was a microphone, and he would talk, and he would talk, and he would talk. And he eventually got rid of the stutter and became the clown prince, and also became an actor. Meadowlark Lemon, who told me that story because of Jim Crow in the 1950s. Shut up and dribble as we get to the end here. That guy's Jeremiah Mahoney. Jeremiah Mahoney was a judge, also the head of the American Athletic Union. I didn't know much about Jeremiah Mahoney until I went to the Holocaust Museum in Washington, D.C. There's a little plaque about him, about his role in 1935 trying to get America to boycott the Hitler Olympics. There's no room for discrimination on grounds of race or color or creed in the Olympics, Mahoney said. The American Athletic Union, of which he was the head, and he chose the participants in the Olympics, in 1933, voted to accept an invitation to compete in Berlin in 1936, provided Germany pledged there would be no discrimination against Jewish athletes. If that pledge is not kept, I personally do not see why we should compete. Mahoney, the president of the AAU. But he had his critics. He did have his critics. Ben Johnson. The Negro in the South is discriminated against as much as the Jews in Germany. It's a futile and hypocritical that Judge Mahoney should attempt to clean up conditions in Germany before cleaning up similar conditions in America. Franklin Roosevelt stayed out of it. He stayed out of it. He urged the American team to go. I worked with Marty Glickman. I knew Sam Stoller, the two Americans that were replaced by Jesse Owens and Ralph Metcalf in the relay race. And I interviewed Gretel Bergman, the Jewish German, who was the best athlete in Europe at the time, who made it all the way up to the end in Germany and then was kicked off the team, which she knew was going to happen. I once said to her, why? She said, I had to give my people hope. They had no hope. Mahoney knew that. Roosevelt did not try to boycott the Olympics. And there is Jesse Owens, and he's saluting the American flag. And you got the Nazis there. Jesse Owens stole the thunder from Adolf Hitler in 1936. but he couldn't get a job after the Olympics. Nor could Mac Robinson. Mac Robinson was the older brother of Jackie Robinson, and he finished second in the 200 meters race behind Owens. So what was a silver medal worth to an American Negro in 1936? Not very much. The only job he could find when he returned home was a street sweeper in Pasadena, California. But the Robinson family liked to protest, and he protested in his own way. He wore his Olympic jacket while working in the white neighborhood during the evenings, sweeping up. The response from the residents, they got the cops to make him take off the jacket. Mexico City, 1968, Harry Edwards. Harry Edwards helped with Tommy Smith, who's in the middle, and John Carlos, who's on the right. Smith advocated a boycott of the '68 Olympics. South Africa and Rhodesia should be uninvited from the Olympics. Actually, South Africa was thrown out in 1964. The restoration of Muhammad Ali's world heavyweight boxing title. And Avery Brundage should step down as the president of the IOC. Avery Brundage, who assured Roosevelt and everybody else Jews would be treated well in 1936 as the American Olympic Committee head. Avery Brundage was a member of the America First Committee back then, and also his construction company built some buildings in Washington, D.C. for the Nazi regime, which still had relationships with the United States in 1937. He also advocated for the hiring of more African-American assistant coaches so they would become head coaches. The protest by Carlos and Smith, carefully planned. As they walked up to the podium, they took off their shoes to protest poverty. They wore beads and a scarf to protest lynchings. When the national anthem was played, they lowered their heads in defiance, raised their fist in the Black Power salute. Rock the world. The Black Power salute. There are two gloves, right glove and the left glove. Carlos has the left glove. Smith has the right glove. Peter Norman, the Australian, suggested to them, who came in second in the race, split the gloves. Norman became a non-citizen, literally, in Australia when they found out his involvement with Smith and Carlos in the protest. Smith later on said, "I don't like the idea of people looking at it as a negative. There was nothing but a raised fist in the air and a bowed head, acknowledging the American flag, not symbolizing a hatred for it." When Norman dies in 2006, Smith and Carlos are two of his pallbearers. Carlos ended up working as a guidance counselor, Palm Springs High School in California. He told the Guardian newspaper, "I had a moral obligation to step up. Morality was a greater force than the rules and regulations the Olympics, had." Peter Norman, on his left breast, he wore one of those Olympic Project for Human Rights badges, an organization that Edwards helped set up. Norman suggested they split the gloves. Norman asked a member of the United States rowing team if he could borrow the badge that read Olympic Projects for Human Rights, a project set up to oppose racism in sports. Carlos and Smith wouldn't get their opportunities in football. Smith with the AFL, soon to be NFL Cincinnati Bengals, with Paul Brown, who hired Negro players in 1946, played 1 year in 1969 with Cincinnati. Carlos was injured. He was on the Philadelphia Eagles roster for a year, played 1 year in the Canadian Football League. Brent Musburger inexplicably still has a career. He's now the head, or now pushing a gambling app or something. He was a sports columnist, Chicago, in 1968 with a paper called the Chicago American. And he was in Mexico City. And he wrote this: "Smith and Carlos look like a couple of black-skinned stormtroopers holding aloft their black-gloved hands during the playing of the national anthem. They sprinkled their symbolism with black track shoes and black scarves and black power medals. It's destined to go down as one of the most unsuitable demonstrations in the history of protest." Now, Smith and Carlos and Musburger have crossed paths over the years. As soon as Musburger sees either one of them, he runs. He's a coward. He will not face them. But he continued his barrage in 2017. Musburger, 2017. On Twitter, Kaepernick, Yo, 49ers, since you instigated protests, 2 wins and 19 losses, how about taking your next knee in the other team's end zone? Musburger has had an incredible career. He has the best agent in the world, Todd Musburger, his brother, because he was hired after he wrote that by CBS. Can you imagine writing something like that today? You might not be able to get away with it. Black-skinned stormtroopers. Smith and Carlos kept their medals. Neither was asked to return them to the IOC. Not part of the Black History Month, but maybe part of the Black History Month, Jimmy Carter. Because black athletes did not compete in the 1980 Moscow Olympics. The Olympic boycott of Moscow was one part of his policy. Soviet Union invades Afghanistan, 1979. Carter issued a trade embargo on 2 goods that the USSR desperately needs: grain and information technology. Think of that one, 40 years ago. He also restricted Soviet fishing in American-controlled waters. The boycott failed. The Soviets would stay in Afghanistan until 1989. That's Thea Gibson. Before there was Billie Jean King, there was Thea Gibson. Well, actually, there was a player named Alice Marble. Thea Gibson was a great player, but she couldn't play in major tournaments. Why couldn't she qualify? Because she was kept out of other tournaments. Alice Marble, in 1950, wrote a letter to the American Lawn Tennis Association magazine. She said a committee member had told her Gibson would be judged on her performance in individual tournaments, to which she was never being invited. Miss Gibson, as Marble wrote, is over a very cunningly wrought barrel. She's being judged by a yardstick of ability. She's not being judged by a yardstick of ability, but by the fact her pigmentation is somewhat different. She's a fellow tennis player, and as such, deserving the chance to prove herself. Alice Marble got, with her protest, Thea Gibson a chance to show her abilities. Now, that's my father-in-law with Billie Jean King in the 1980s, and I always ask this question of people, and I'm going to ask it of you. Civil rights pioneer or not? Billie Jean King. Yes or no?
She was rights for women.
Yep.
So.
There were 2, in the 1960s, there were 2 civil rights movements going. One was for blacks. One was for women. Women's liberation. Because if you went to a college and you were a woman prior to 1972, the college could say, you're not getting those courses. You're not going to medical school. You're not going to law school. You could be a nurse. It's great. You could be a teacher. Good.
In sports,
secretary.
There wasn't much for sports.
There wasn't much for sports either. She learned her game on the streets, literally, as did Jimmy Connors. Billie Jean King is a civil rights pioneer. Whether you like it or not, she is. And she's a nice woman, too. I've always enjoyed being with her. She's probably a step down, or 2 or 3 steps down from Martin Luther King, but what she did for women was very important. Also black women, like Venus and Serena Williams today. Her role in the civil rights movement is clearly defined. She pushed for equal prize money in men's and women's matches after winning the U.S. Open in 1972. She's paid $15,000 less than the men's champion, Ilie Nastase. She threatened to sit out the 1970 U.S. Open if the prize money was not equal to men. In 1973, the U.S. Open became the first major tournament to offer equal prize money for men and women. Her aggressive stance in the 1960s was part of a sea change that culminated in a law being passed. The Title IX of the 1972 Education Amendments changed women's sports. It wasn't supposed to. It was supposed to change educational opportunities for women. Signed into law by Richard Nixon, who I knew. And another talk, I'll tell you about how I knew Nixon. Billie Jean King could have been blackballed from tennis in 1970 because she and 8 others started a tournament for women, tour for women. The women's organized tour never could find a sponsor. during the despite the 1964 Surgeon General's report that cigarette smoking was harmful to a smoker's health, the only company willing to put up money for Billie Jean King and the tennis tour is Philip Morris and the Virginia Slims brand. The tour took the money. Hey, you've come a long way, baby, to get to where you are today. You got your own cigarette now, baby. You've come a long way. That was 1969. They get the money right after that for the tour. Now, Billie Jean King told me that it was pro-choice, that women could decide whether or not they should smoke and whether it was harmful to the smoker. That's how she justified it. And also they needed the money. This is Maud Abdul Rauf. Before Kaepernick, there was him. He was with the Denver Nuggets in 1995. He viewed the flag as a symbol of oppression and racism, and he didn't want to stand for the national anthem. He was fined $32,000 by the NBA, but they made a compromise. He would stand during the anthem, but instead of looking at the flag, he would turn his head down and pray. He had no regrets whatsoever. Once you throw something out there, you have to own it. The National Basketball Players Association didn't defend him or Craig Hodges, who got bounced from the NBA because he decided to tell George H.W. Bush that there is a plight that Negroes still had in 1992. Today, the NBA and the National Basketball Players Association have become socially proactive. The reactions to Abdul Rauf, two Denver radio disc jockeys. I'm part of the radio, was part of the radio. It's not a very proud industry anymore. Used to be, not because of things like this. Two Denver disc jockeys trespassed en masse to play the national anthem with their trumpets in Denver. 5 years later, arsonists burned down Abdul Rauf's home in Gulfport, Mississippi. That's the White House. It's my wife in front of the White House. Athletes go to the White House. John Kennedy had athletes at the White House in 1963. Ronald Reagan brought back that in 1984. Andrew Johnson had baseball players at the White House in 1865. There's Craig Hodges, and then there are athletes like Tim Thomas, who told the Boston Bruins, Stanley Cup team, the management, he wasn't going to the White House to celebrate with Barack Obama because he didn't like Barack Obama. Hodges did get a face-to-face with George H.W. Bush. Probably lost his job in the NBA because he spoke his mind. There is Obama with the Boston Bruins in 2011. There is Craig Hodges 3 years ago. Hodges wore a dashiki, wrote a letter highlighting challenges facing the African-American community, which he delivered to Marlon Fitzwater, the White House press secretary, to give to George H.W. Bush. His clothing had the biggest impact, he thought, on the state. He could still shoot three-point plays. He wasn't that good defensively, but he could still score. NBA teams decided his talent was not enough to justify the distraction he might cause. He was out. A couple of years ago, the Golden State Warriors won the NBA championship, and Donald Trump invited them to the White House and then disinvited them. Durant said I wasn't going to go. I disrespect who's in the office right now. I don't agree with what he agrees with, so my voice is going to be heard by not doing that. But his voice wasn't heard. He had an opportunity to speak his mind, and he never did. It goes on Twitter, though. Donald Sterling was the owner of the Los Angeles Clippers from about 1983 to 2014. During David Stern's tenure, 30-year tenure at the NBA, Sterling made a lot of racist comments. Stern looked the other way. Stern was gone in 2014. Adam Silver had to clean up a mess. So he's with his companion, maybe his mistress, V. Stiviano, in her 15 Minutes of Fame. She made a recording of him ranting about her showing up at Clippers games with African-American men that somehow ended up in Harvey Levin's hands at TMZ. He admonished her, don't bring black friends to any more games. Well, the Clipper players decided, we're going to walk. We're going to protest. It's going to be our boycott if he remains the owner. They didn't walk, but the marketing partners walked. And when money walks, people talk. And the NBA looked at all of these sponsors that walked away, and Adam Silver decided it's not worth the trouble anymore, throw him out of the league. And he was thrown out of the league. But David Stern ignored a long history of racist comments that were available